trips. We're on page 37. Imagine thousands of slavers making tens of thousands of trips with this decision in mind. Consider the enormity of the shipping industry it would have taken in order to bring Europe out of its backwardness. Think about it. With great overhead expenses, what kind of profit would that require? What kind of profit would they have to have? Further, on those trips, imagine there being extremely few of the totally incompetent physicians caring for the livestock, our ancestors. Visualize the Dr. Frankensteins and Dr. Jekylls who had permanently gone over to their Mr. Hyde selves, as well as the other criminal minds who found safe passage and wages on board these death ships, controlling and caring for us. Think about being treated by dispossessed quacks who could no who could get no other job besides keeping us alive long enough to get us to market because their own people were wise enough not to allow them to practice on them. Imagine an enterprise so grand and successful that even incredible levels of illness and death, medical incompetence, haphazard navigating, financial mismanagement, and inept personnel could not sabotage this enterprise. But let us take a moment to pause and seriously think about the quality of medical care furnished on these floating trauma units because we were there. See yourself being attended to by failed physicians who couldn't make the cut for healing their own people or their own people's animals. Imagine being treated by people who saw you as a guinea pig for a failed science experiment. Imagine being handled by someone whose only reference point for healing was trauma, who only knew how to suppress pain with no notion of healing. Imagine having gaping, insufferable wounds that are gangrened limbs and appendages that give so much pain that you are forced to beg these loathsome aliens to operate on them, anesthetics or not. We should know that the Africans, which these Europeans carried across the water, were treated with the same level of medical inhumanity as their descendants who slaved in this country. We should also know that females were treated equally as bad as males. Anesthesia was not considered economical or necessary for our enslaved ancestors. According to the theory at the time, which also helped rationalize the wanton destruction of plant and animal life, Africans, like other animals, did not have the capacity to truly feel pain. There was no care in this land, so you know there was even less care taken at sea. It makes you wonder what type of mindset these people had. Oh, that's right. It was profit over people. So they had to dehumanize the people. The belief that Africans could not truly feel pain fit the warped mind of a people who thrive off of other people's pain. It was a white supremacist rationale for their inhumanity toward us. It worked in concert with the claims that Africans had no spirit and therefore needed religion to fit into the warped agenda of a spiritless people. On this point, imagine clerics being brought on these voyages to watch over us. These are the same men of God who softened our minds with lies of a white God and a white salvation before their armies brought the rifle and the cannon. Remember that these religious fathers, rabbis, and other assorted priests, pastors, and ministers were as great or even greater enslavers as those who claim no calling other than enslaver. Greetings, Sister Ra. How are you tonight? I'm so glad you're here. Imagine these heathens praying for your soul. Know, African warrior scholar, that the same time at that same time came no religious belief or newfound sense of morality was behind their church's efforts to cease the enslavement of Africans. England, the primary instigator in stopping the transport of enslaved Africans to the Americas, pursued this agenda only for two reasons. One was because the use of enslaved Africans by other European and non European countries had created too much economic competition for them to bear. And they had the military means to stop others from transporting us. The other reason that was suppressing our enslavement was the most expedient means to regain a semblance of peace on the continent so that colonization, which is an internal enslavement, could more peacefully be ushered in. Only in this way could they begin to systematically control Africa's resources and therefore dominate the world market better from home. These are the same hypocritical politics used during the Civil War when the North convinced us that they were bent on destroying the use of Africans for free labor in the South because it was an evil institution and instigated a civil war, when in truth, the North only wanted to regain dominance of the economy by removing the South's competitive advantage, which was our free labor. Greetings, KW Don 7. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. Our humanity and condition were not even insignificant afterthoughts in either the Civil War here nor the suppression of our capture on the continent for enslavement here. Both of their wars against the so called world, called World Wars I and II, as well as the Cold War, which followed their Second World War against the world, and the Civil War, were contests over which brother would be the primary beneficiary over their united domination of us, and which would only receive the leftovers. All Europeans form one nation. Marco Rubio reminded us of that, didn't he, in the news recently, that all Europeans form one nation? Therefore, all wars between Europeans are civil wars to shuffle and reestablish their hierarchy within a unified global domination. They are not us, and therefore, unless we allow them to be, their problems are not ours. So let us return to our ancestors' nightmare so that all the whining and sniveling we exhibit over not being loved by Europeans can truly be examined in our historical context. Let us return to that which can empower us through remembrance, that grievous part of our story we are specifically focusing on herein. Now that you have been tightly packed in rows, chained to the person on your left and your right, with those chains then bolted down at the row's end, Now that everyone has been secured and your slaver has set sail, imagine lying on that hard, unforgiving, diseased wooden surface, see yourself lying there, having to urinate and defecate, but having nowhere to go but on yourself and on that floor. You cannot move about much where you are lying, and even if you could move a few more inches, there's still no other place to go. Bodily waste begins to cover your skin, wet and dried, and nauseatingly smells as bodily waste do. You have no power to remove it. Your hands are not free to push it away, and there is no water to wash it off. What waste coming from the Africans on the floors above you adds to what has already come out of you and those beside you and around you on the floor. It only adds to the already unbearable stench and disease. It is hot, very hot, and heat intensifies stench. In you need if you need to make in this instance more authentic, imagine being locked inside one of the portable outhouses that are set up for outdoor events for a hot summer day. Imagine having to lay or sit on other people's feces and urine. Even though you will have the advantage of some space to move around in and a place to sit down, you cannot leave or turn away from the stench. This is similar to what you would feel and smell like as an African on a slaver, where you turn, an incomprehensible insanity awaits your senses. There would be no release, real or imagined, from this affront to your sanity. Of course, on board the slaver, you are being forced to contribute to the body of waste. There is only so long you can hold back your natural bodily functions. So imagine the panicky feeling of losing control. Try to think about what it would feel like to be an adult, unable to hold it in public. Imagine urinating on yourself, throwing up on yourself, defecating on yourself. Imagine being unable to wipe yourself after defecating, unable because you could not reach yourself because your wrists are tied to the Africans on your left and on your right. And think about how often, if even you were able to reach afar enough, having nothing to wipe yourself with but that hand which you cannot clean and which you use to remove maggots from open wounds and carry food to your mouth. Imagine falling victim to the release of multiple such defecations, because even when what remains of your strength of mind, your muscles weakened by an alien nutritionless diet, are unable to hold your runny feces even momentarily. Feel that powerlessness gripping your mind with involuntary release of bodily waste. Feel yourself reaching for an increasingly elusive sanity as these movements are compounded by a persistent diarrhea made worse by your body's ongoing rebelling against a diet that is totally contrary to anything it has ever known. Then multiply this by the number of your brothers and sisters on board whose bodies are similarly rebelling. Know that the time spent in our coffles of blood and tears and the dungeons is in no way long enough for their bodies to begin to adjust to bad, inedible so called food either. Greetings, forecast. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. In a few rare cases, African females on these slavers were allowed to sit over the rough edge of the halved barrel to eliminate their body waste. But, as we said, this was only in a very few cases. And we know that everything the enslavers did was for us to benefit them. So, knowing this, we can rest assured that this toilet privilege was reserved for those coveted females who Europeans, although filthy, unbathed, bedwetters themselves, did not want to further soil their own sheets. Regardless, there you lie, waste uncontrollably forcing itself out of your body because you can no longer hold it in. This is not the first time since you started on this voyage that you could not hold it, and you know it will not be your last. In addition, you have been in this spot long enough to have experienced feces, usually in its diuretic liquid form, and urine from the other Africans chained in their places above you, seeping down through the cracks into the floor, onto you and those around you. The Europeans' solution to this equally unthinkable was and is a science of suppressing the symptoms of disease, not the eradication of the disease itself. As in the social arena, suppression was and is considered cure. Out of sight, out of mind. When diarrhea became epidemic, endangering the profits expected from the human cargo, large corks, too large and inserted in too far to be removed by hand, were forced into the anuses of Africans to block the exit of any and every bodily waste. The ensuing painful constipation and backup of poisons was irrelevant. The diuretic flow was stopped. So imagine yourself lying in filth, disease, spittle, vomit, pus, slime, unidentifiable excretions from bed sores, fleas, ringworms, and lice. Yes, lice, because they were so numerous on the crew members that we had become so soiled that they had something to latch on to. Imagine worms, maggots in bodily waste, maggots thriving in the bed sores on your back, arms, legs, and head, and the whips, welts, and the wounds cut and opened by the metal cuffs locked to your wrists, ankles, and sometimes necks. Wounds that salt water was often poured onto and into to increase your pain under the lie of washing your skin. Imagine the never ending scratching, tearing through your skin wherever you could reach to get at the parasites and disease that was infesting your body. Surely you can feel the splinters that have been digging under your skin once you were slid head first into your wooden hole. Or maybe, like many, they have been so they have been in so long that they have begun to feel normal. Imagine sweat, tears, human and rat feces, blood, pieces of flesh, teeth, toenails, fingernails, hair, menstrual blood, aborted feces, broken water, dead babies. And yes, many captured women were pregnant when they were captured, and many more were impregnated through the rape by sadistic aliens during the coffle marches and in the dungeons. Imagine afterbirth. Imagine screaming, moaning, numbing pain, living bodies not moving for days. This was no game, no pleasure cruise, no joyride for our ancestors. It was the beginning of the worst living nightmare a people experienced since humanity stepped foot on this planet. It was raw, unrelenting terror. Only someone seeking to universalize and normalize European barbarities or make our Holocaust less tragic than it actually was would paint a picture that allowed us to rest easy with our past as a mercilessly dehumanized, enslaved people. What happens to a body that has become so diseased inside and out that it is unable to heal? It no longer functions normally. It becomes unable to take care of or heal itself. It begins to fall apart, to decay, to atrophy, to die. We know that a body in good health has the capacity to heal itself. A healthy body naturally works towards physiological equilibrium. That is its prime directive. But during the Middle Passage, captive Africans were kept in severely weakened states because of the quality and denial of food, water, air, light, and even exercise. They were denied life. And this deprivation was in addition to their unbelievably sadistically violent treatment. In the face of such extremely diseased health, it is no wonder that even the most minor wounds and sores they received healed slowly, if at all, and could lead to death. Like the patient with a defective immune system, our ancestors were more susceptible to dying from small sores, cuts, or bruises, or even diseases that normally had very low probabilities of becoming fatal. We must also remember that in addition to existing in severely deteriorated health, they were confined to already highly contagious, contaminated environments. Imagine lying next to someone, a friend or close relative, possibly your brother or father or son, who is no longer alive. Can you picture yourself being chained to them, unable to move? Do you know how a human corpse smells after a few days, a few months, a few weeks? Think about lying next to death, unable to move away. Imagine intense grief, grief beyond belief. Imagine dying from grief because your anguish from watching the destruction of a close loved one. On the other hand, imagine relief, a delusional relief, but imagine that relief, the relief that involuntarily comes from a people packed so tightly together for months on end that knowing someone has died means that soon another body will be taken away, which will give you a little more room to move. Can you imagine yourself experiencing more and more relief coming as a third or even half of your captured brothers and sisters die and are removed, giving you more room to breathe? To add misery to wretchedness, imagine being in the company of a walking disease, of the blight appearing as human that is ravaging your world. Imagine being touched, poked, prodded by Europeans, historically the greatest upright carriers of disease. It is a genetic predisposition conditioned by centuries of not bathing and living in filth and squalor and sleeping with and having sex with animals. We know this peculiar trait because we know that everywhere they went on the face of this planet, people contracted the contagion that they brought, but they developed disease from no other group of human people. Their bodies had developed a high tolerance for powerful diseases that they carried. How diseased our ancestors must have become in these holes from such close and constant contact with Europeans, as well as being exposed to the buildup of filth on these ships, trip after trip after trip. We were kept in places fit only for the diseased and the disease carrying rats who came stowed away in the hulls of these filthy ships. Why do you think cats were always part of their crew? Cats were on board to kill the diseased rats they carried, the fleas that carried disease. These were the same rats and fleas that brought back the Black Plague of old Europe. As you become one with your ancestors, remember also, as you lie there with them, fully exposed and unable to protect yourself, that rats eat whatever is available. Hunger easily drives them to consume human flesh. Western slums bear abundant records of this. Imagine looking down weeks after your body has become numb because you have been unable to move, and then suddenly you feel something. You see rats gnawing away at any part of your foot or thigh. You can see the shackles and feel the stiffened muscles preventing you from being able to kick or flail your limbs to make them stop eating you, more of you. Where can you mentally go to escape this madness? Imagine living through all of this because you did. You are your ancestors, and they are you. Turning from what ate at us to what we ate, think about the taste of cold, nasty smelling, nasty tasting gruel we were fed on land to make worse, made worse by the conditions of long voyages across the sea. It was a mixture of slop unfit for pigs. It wouldn't be hard to imagine most of us refusing to do so, but at the same time, we know that this disobedience would not be tolerated by our enslavers. Profit was at stake. We could not be allowed to starve ourselves to death. So feel the strength and pain of those of us who refuse to eat this venom, even after the whippings and beatings, even after red hot coals were placed on our lips, searing our already blistered lips in an effort to make us open our mouths. After all this had failed, bear witness to the final measure where we were held down while our teeth were knocked out by a device that was hammered into our mouths called a speculum oris that stretched our mouths open so that the slop could be shoveled down our throats. And this was only one of the devices used to force feed Africans. Doing these things to us was not problematic for our enslavers because they were well aware that physical damage, such as missing body parts, rape, broken bones, the cuts of whip, and so forth, would not visibly be carried to the next generation. They were thoroughly acquainted with the fact that the most important scars being transferred from one generation to the next were psychological. The experience of mistreating their own had taught them how easily psychological trauma could be concealed beneath layers of callous scar tissue and fear. So they knew the psychological impact that the torturous mind shattering acts like rape would have on the minds of the victim and those who witnessed it. And they knew the impact would be the same whether we witnessed it physically in front of us or knew it in our minds, that this was what was happening behind closed doors. Would it make you feel more comfortable because you could not actually see your enemy rape your mother, wife, or daughter? If, however, as a descendant of these Africans, you became an apologist for our mistreatment, you might search for conditions or treatments which somehow appear to compensate for these inhuman violations. You might argue, as many have done when trying to explain away the violation of African children adopted by European and colored homosexual pedophiles, that they are at least eating. You might say, as apologists say, that Europeans were doing the best they could given the ignorance of savages who could not understand their white saviors. In your menticidal delusion, you might even go so far as to say that Europeans were only trying to save Africans from themselves in using whatever means they could find to keep them from starving themselves to death. In your blind effort to defend some unfounded European humanity, you might believe that food indicates caring and not a fattening of prey. Although we must know that the African caught in the hell of the slavers, although prey, were not being fattened. Those who lived to see other shores were barely being kept alive. They were a stock that, as far as the captains and crew were concerned, needed only to be kept alive long enough to reach the dock for unloading. So, this diet of nutritionless gruel kept most Africans in a state of increasing starvation. Knowing the cruelty of our enslavers, it would not take a leap in common sense to recognize that our ancestors were barely surviving on less than 1 cup of this slop daily. An even more incredible thought would be to imagine the kind of hunger that would drive you to desire gruel, a hunger that it would take to cause an African to voluntarily swallow a substance that goes against your spiritual, mental, and physical well-being. A hunger that would make you desirous enough to even consider a food that had to be strained through your teeth in order to not swallow the maggots and bugs living in it as tasty. Ask yourself, what level of starvation would it take to drive you to violently fight those chained to you in order to get a larger share of it? The lies they tell us to cover up this fundamentally moral disgrace, though, are weak. All we need to do is think using just a smidgen of our ancestral wisdom. We have to combine what we know about diet with what we know about the conditions of captivity on these slave ships. Are we gullible enough to honestly believe that these heartless, pale creatures took the time daily, not to mention 2 or 3 times a day, to unchain, pull feet first off platforms, water and feed hundreds of us upright? When they then return us securely to our positions? No. Moreover, how were these spineless cowards in total fear of us able to do this inside the crippling darkness of the ship's hull? To make matters worse for them, there was little to no room to move between the rows of us. What single European male, or even a heavily armed group of them, would have been brave enough, or rather stupid enough, to walk the length of these dark aisles, guided only by a feeble flickering lamp, dispensing food and drink to a loose, encircling mass of enraged, starving, captive Africans who knew you were their mortal enemy? If they were afraid of us on deck, where there was ample light and they had room to aim, shoot, and run, then they definitely feared us in the darkened holds. Just looking at the drawings of how tightly Africans were packed on the floors of these slavers, even if the hulls were well lit, and even if they had no fear of us, it is hard to imagine just how we were fed once a day. Use your common sense. How could the lie we have been fed of our ancestors having 3 or even 2 good meals a day be a realistic probability? In these dark, floating prisons, torture came in more ways than wanton physical brutality and psychic shock. It came in every way imaginable. Diet was only one aspect of the torture our bodies experienced. Imagine being in a sauna with no way out. Better yet, imagine being in a hermetically sealed sauna with 50 dirty and diseased people where there is only room for 10. Can you feel a heat and humidity so oppressively high that you can barely breathe? Take the time to give some serious thought to how weeks and months of being in this condition with less than a pint of dirty, stagnant water to drink each day affects the human mind and body. Can you imagine bodies pressing in on you on all sides in stifling heat? Can you imagine daily temperatures inside these packed, unventilated ovens of over 100 degrees in the warmer seasons, with records going as high as 120 and 130 degrees, with humidity levels between 75 and 90%? It was a perpetual steam bath, and you were stewing in your own feces and vomit and urine and afterbirth and other bodily fluids of every imaginable kind. Can you imagine having to watch a friend slowly dying from heat stroke? We see this today as too many of our elders die during the summer in their inadequately ventilated, unair conditioned homes, or when their houses catch on fire because their fear of our children's rage and immorality has led them to install window and door bars that they become unable to open in a panic to survive. You must feel the heat to know this truth. In addition, as we mentioned above, Can you imagine how it would feel to have so little air coming in or circulating inside these ovens because portals were not built, had been sealed up, or had been made so very small so that the human cargo would not toss out their babies or squeeze their emaciated bodies through them? Picture only a few small or no portals for hundreds of Africans packed on multiple decks. Listen to the moans and dying whispers as you witness those around you slowly asphyxiating. But our ancestors' asphyxiations were not quick. It took time. So be respectful of what they went through for us and take time to earnestly reflect on being short of air for months of endlessly gasping for air or constantly feeling that this may be your last breath. Compare that with what you know of being a victim to painful, relentless asthma attacks. Imagine the ongoing agony Africans held captive in cramped, torrid, lightless, virtually airless quarters would feel in their lungs. Give some serious scientific thought to the effects that a chronically restricted oxygen intake would have on your lungs, your body, your brain, which requires this precious oxygen to live and think. The forecast says they also ate us on the ships when they ran out of food. Yes, they did. And I wonder, with them eating us when they ran out of food, did they clean us? Because these were nasty people. You know what I mean? They had some water. Did they clean us thoroughly? You know, did they clean us thoroughly before they consumed our flesh to feed themselves on these ships? Imagine suffocating your brain. Imagine irreparable brain damage resulting from the prolonged lack of air. Better yet, imagine the quality of the air which fueled the brain that was breathed in by those farthest from the hatch. Air, that is, which came in those few times when the hatch was open. Remember that under ideal conditions, you must have two openings for air to circulate well. Remember that just opening the hatch would not be enough to bring in fresh air. Coming up on deck through the small fortified opening, even for a momentary release from that unrelenting inferno, based on the occasional enslaver's need to have us entertain them while exercising in heavy cutting metal chains and cuffs so we would be better fit for sail, was not common, even among the so called good captains. And it became increasingly less common as Europeans recognized that bringing Africans on deck increased the probability of successful revolts. And the late development of machines that allowed for slightly better ventilation in order to save more human cargo from heat stroke and a slow, painful death, a technology of dubious quality, which was installed only on a small number of ships anyway, were motivated purely by profit. There was not a shred of humanity in the equation. Only a fool would believe, as many still do, that the intense heat and humidity posed no hardship for Africans because they came from searing hot jungles anyway. What kind of Africans today would sacrifice their ancestors' good name by swallowing and passing on these lies without question in order to gain the love and approval of the children of those whom did every heartless thing we can imagine to them to destroy them. What kind of people seek to forget their ancestors? Sister Ross says that these slavers and their descendants are not people at all. They're aliens from another planet. And finally, while we're pointing out the inhumanity of the environment below deck, also remember that there was nothing to hold on to but our shackles and a slimy wooden floor as we were being violently tossed back and forth against the chains and cuffs binding you to others in this suffocating oven during nature's many furious storms, torrential storms, some lasting for weeks at a time, are as much a part of ocean behavior as calm waves and smooth currents. Know that the practice of tearing African families apart continued as we crossed the Kemetic Ocean. African men were kept from seeing and being with their spouses, daughters, mothers, and sisters. African men were sequestered into one part of the ship, while African women and small children were held captive in another. Merciless wooden walls kept the men from seeing their women and girls, and boys in many cases, but allowed their crying, wailing, screaming, and praying to penetrate. Knowing the inhumane possibilities of what was being done to them wreaked havoc on our men's minds and emotions. Because you see, African women were unable to see or be with their spouses, sons, fathers, or brothers. African men and boys were segregated into separate quarters beyond their view. So they too were divided from their men and boys by the same insensitive walls which tortured them with crying, wailing, screaming, and prayers. Imagine the psychological anguish that brought. The beatings, the whippings, the cuttings, the stabbings, the shootings, the torturings, the rapes, the sodomizations that we endured all along the long coffles were not too distant a memory. And there is no forgetting hell. So sisters and brothers alike were being cut open in open mental wounds. So your imaginings of what's behind those sounds coming from behind those merciless wooden walls are even more vividly haunting. They torment our confused minds with unknowing. They give us no rest because we know that no human makes those sounds unless in extreme physical and or mental anguish. We know the terror has not ceased. We know that each collection of African women and girls in the coffles from the interior, in the dungeons along the shore, on the ships resting on the edge of and sailing across the Kemetic Ocean, serve as a private harem, the private sex slaves of the white men involved. If you are a male, you feel the deepest of humiliations for not being able to protect them from the pale faced aggressors. If you are a woman, you feel the deepest humiliation for being violated and for not being able to protect your daughters from the ravaging menace. Today, because you are observing this travesty through the eyes of our ancestors, you know why men, women, and girls and boys have been separated, because you have been allowed to see clearly through our ancestors' eyes. You have intimately come to know that the Europeans divide, demoralize, and exploitative tactics. When our ancestors could not have known, what our ancestors could not have known is that they have gleaned these practices from their own experience. With hindsight, you are fully aware that they practiced this crude form of slavery on each other before coming after our ancestors to perfect it. From their experiments with controlling each other, they learned that the best way to control the men is through controlling their women and children. And you know from what you see them doing to our ancestors that they have well learned that free sexual access to women and children is only possible when they have been physically isolated from their men and are corralled within easy reach of violation. Even though African men and women cannot see each other, we know that neither group is being respected as humans. Whether you are a man or a woman, you know that the other is in unbearable pain, pain which you cannot help to ease or release them from. If you are a man, you know that the insufferable conditions of these vessels was compounded by the systematic rape and abuse of our females. If you are a woman, you know that a coffin like space is compounding the men's torture in just being alive here. The sodomization of your males is beyond comprehension. It is a dehumanizing violation foreign to your mind in either war or peace. However, whether African man or African woman, you are not a victim of lopsided, divisive, Eurocentric, sexist thinking. You know that the difference in your oppression by these beasts, as defined by your sex, is negligible, distracting, and meaningless. And that's true to this very day when they try to bring up sexist narratives, feminism, or misandry noir. All of these concepts are Eurocentric concepts meant to divide us. Before being there, you know no one is in their right African mind would think to judge which transgression is worse. Neither's treatment is worse than the other. Moreover, in the context of our communal nature, we know that such a debate would be meaningless, for we are one people. When our women suffer, we suffer. When our men suffer, we suffer. When our children suffer, we suffer. We suffer as one. And if we are to heal as warrior scholars, as a people of our ancestors, we must go back to get better, get a better, clearer picture of what was done to us, to all of us. If we are ever if we are ever to be conscious, powerful, self-respecting African adults, we must delve deeply into the origins of our menticide. The enemy within is being passed down to our children because of our inability and or refusal to see the whole of the many pieces missing or misarticulated in our story. The forecast says patriarchy. That word annoys me, especially in American context. Absolutely, and it should. We must reverse this cycle of fearful ignorance. We must see that what was done before, we must see what was done before so that our menticide can no longer hold us in its deadly suicidal grip. The magnitude and pervasiveness of others' assaults against us, as well as our responses, will become crystal clear because, in truth and reality, what is happening to us today is already beyond any African imagination. And what we see today speaks to what cometh tomorrow. So let us reflect on the insanity evident in African men and women, boys and girls today, drowning in this modern anti African Western madness. Look around and open your African eyes so that you can see us in our various destroyed forms as sexual predators, as the dark shadows of master violations, modeling ourselves after our keepers and destroyers, mimicking self hatred till we come to think of it as our very own. Look at our families here, now, sub integrated into this cultural chaos where adults and children run around playing games where the rules have us lusting after each other as sexual prey. This deeply ingrained menticide has us seeing each other only as sexual meals to temporarily drug all human senses of right and wrong and feel a gluttonous, perverted, pain seeking, extremely individualistic sexual appetite. Just look at how fractionalized Africans have become today, broken so far apart from our traditions that we can no longer see a need for African family, African community, or African interpersonal allegiance. Scarred so deeply that we cannot see inviolable limits. If not, we would not be flattering rapists through imitation. Think about how many hundreds, thousands, or millions, but of how many hundreds of millions of rapes would have had to occur in order for the majority of us to be contaminated with white blood. The vast majority of Africans enslaved throughout New Europe, which are North and South America, came from dark skinned lineages of West Africa. Think about the amount of sexual violence it would take to turn an unquestionably unwilling Black people brown, tan, and off white. Consider the confusion of a beautiful Black people shamed into believing that dark skin is a sin. Can you imagine wanting to be the product of rape? Can you imagine a crime this inhumane as being seen as a blessing, bestowing good hair, light skin, and white features on its victims? Can you imagine the level of self hate it would take for darker skinned Africans to resent not being the beneficiary of rape? The heartless assault against our being on the slavers also found expression in the murder of Africans for the sake of business and pleasure. Yes, Africans were murdered in order to collect insurance money. This crime is the supreme precedent of global insurance fraud. Countless murders were committed by Europeans, by sadistic, psychopathic racists thriving off of others' pains. They tossed Africans overboard because of rebellion, water or food shortages, disease and death, or just because. And they did it knowing that they would not be paid for us, that they would be paid for us, whether we arrived at our destinations or not. Yet we know that the toll would have been even higher if not for the growing demand for enslaved Africans to work the plantations of New Europe or North and South America. African labor in New Europe subsidized the drunken capitalist orgy in Old Europe as well as the goods carried to and from Africa and the world. So care had to be taken to make sure that at least half of those who departed arrived to be worked to death on their plantations. This fact made our journey no easier. Those not murdered en route faced impossible hardship. Imagine being beaten senselessly, regularly, gang raped, many of our sisters being gang raped to the point of death. Imagine what that would take regularly. What would it feel like to have one or both of your breasts cut off, to be hung up by your neck with a rope or by your tongue or under your chin with a hook, to have your belly slit open and watch your vital organs spill out on the deck? And if you were pregnant, having the fetus snatched out of you, slammed onto the floor, stomped, and then flung overboard. Imagine having your fingers screwed under a press until they burst open on both sides. Imagine being shot for fighting for your freedom or simply for target practice to entertain the crew when they were bored of entertaining each other. Imagine not being shot on deck, but picked off while bobbing about on the waves after having been thrown overboard. How would it feel to be used as a target for knife or axe throwing? How about being decapitated or hung from a mast and having your head or body left on display until the flesh rotted from your bones as a warning sign against the rebellion of your brothers and sisters? All of these and many other untold horrors were the lot of our ancestors on these blood ships. I'll call them death ships. To know this truth, you only have to think up the worst that could happen to you and yours while held in captivity by a people who despise you beyond words for what they cannot be or do. You only have to let your mind dwell on the worst sodomization, ripping skin apart until there is no hope of ever healing it. The worst cuts, wounds so deep and gaping that you go into shock from disbelief. The worst clubbings, beatings so bad that you lose feeling in your appendages and control over your bodily functions. So bad that your ribs cut into lung tissue with every shallow breath. So bad that you can see one of your own eyes dangling out of its socket. Think of the worst sadism you can even think. You can think of the worst sadism you think even the most deranged European can exact, pain that only death can relieve, and start imagining from that point. These acts of savagery were not anomalies. If our relationship with Europeans tells us anything, they were much more the norm than not. Remember that on average, a third or half of us never made it all the way across the Kemetic Ocean. That incredible feat of inhumanity took the tormented mind of an evil genius. It required the mind of those who fed on creating pain and disorder. W.E.B. Du Bois, who was as much an apologist for the European enslavement of Africans as Eric Williams, provides a striking example of what was normal on these death ships, saying this: a slave ship with 442 slaves was bound from Guinea to Jamaica. 60 of the slaves died from overcrowding, the captain being short of water through 96 more overboard. Afterwards, 26 more were drowned. 10 drowned themselves in despair. Yet the ship reached port before the water was exhausted. Now, as a social scientist, though he thoroughly understood the instructive qualities inherent in using the average as a valid indicator of the whole, what he stated in this quote was much more of the average story of the slaver's voyage than not. Most African deaths on board these slavers were not suicides. Most were not the result of African revolts. A great many of those of us lost at sea did not die from the disease that had soaked into the hulls of these ships, and age was almost never a factor in determining a natural death. Murder ruled our fate on these high seas. Suicides deserve a special look, though, because in contrast to how they sympathetically defined it for themselves as a desperate, troubled call for help, Europeans intentionally misinterpreted it for Africans who made this choice. These acts of remarkable bravery were arrogantly misconstrued by European historians as mindless acts of crazed, weak willed people instead of the willful, intelligent acts of warriors refusing to become or allow their children to become enslaved. These were acts courageously chosen by individuals who knew that life was part of the cycle and death a way to return home. That's a key African cosmological perspective, that life and death are parts of a cycle and that death takes you home. It doesn't take you to hell or heaven, it takes you home. Those Africans who aborted the voyage of their own volition, as well as those who were successfully carted all the way across the Kemetic Ocean, are the ancestors we owe our lives to. So it makes no sense to discriminate against those two groups of enslaved Africans based on someone else's logic. Certainly, there were traders on the continent and in New Europe, although there is no known record of one among the human cargo taken across the Kemetic Ocean. That, in and of itself, is an interesting point to ponder in terms of the generations it takes to turn a people against themselves. The forecast asks a very profound question. Where do you come from before you are born? Probably the same place that you return to. Absolutely. But to take a divisive position of pride using the claim that we are the children of the strongest, of those who survived the Middle Passage, is uncalled for and moves against the whole African ancestry who struggled for us to remain African. It's uncalled for to, excuse me, but to take a divisive position of pride using the claim that we are the children of the strongest, of those who survived the Middle Passage, is uncalled for, and it moves us against the whole of the ancestors who struggled for us to remain African. Are we to dismiss as weaker those who were murdered along the way? We could make an equally convincing argument that we are the children of the weakest because the strongest, most determined, and most intelligent were most likely to violently rebel against their oppressors and valiantly met death. but that would be equally absurd. It would do no more than create the same ancestor dividing and destroying result in our minds. We should acknowledge our ancestors who died fighting on slavers or jumping overboard alongside those who survived the Middle Passage. Greetings, Anthony McPhail. I'm so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. We're on page 57 of 89. We're going to finish the text tonight. On these slavers, different choices were made by individual Africans in the interest of Africans. All of these choices were made by African warriors who knew that they were at war, who knew who their enemy was, and who fought them with every weapon at their disposal. Sadly, many Africans today are claiming a superiority because their ancestors lived to internalize the European way, have no notion of war. Our enemy is waging war, and have no notion of the war our enemy is waging against us. Many, even if they did not know, still would not act because of fear. For those Africans who chose to fight from from another realm, suicide was a conscious act of rebellion. Suicide is rebellion. It denies the oppressor and enemy the right and ability to rule over another. It eliminates the victim. It forecloses victory. Warriors fight oppression by whatever means necessary. Imagine what it took for an African to take his or her life and or the life of his or her child. Imagine Europeans having to construct huge fan-like nets extending far out from the sides of so many slaving vessels in order to catch the many Africans who would rather drown than live as less than their ancestors. Remember that this attempt to belittle Africans who took their lives on the high seas is the same supremacist arrogance that scientifically classified any African who chose to rebel by running away from the plantation as insane. They gave this insanity names such as drapetomania and dysanthesia, Ethiopia, attributing our rebellion to genetic predispositions, to laziness, and to outright refusal to obey rightful commands. Our enslavers on land and sea, in their psychopathologically racist confusion, naturally ask why anyone in their right mind, anyone who understood that they were inferior and who had been placed in the benevolent care of their superiors, would try to escape an enslavement, even a dehumanizing enslavement that could save them from themselves. We also have to step back for a moment to see that our ancestors were not the only victims of the white plague that wreaked havoc on this world. These harbingers of death also called their disorder under the waves. Visualize, if you will, our movement across the Kemetic Ocean, even changing nature. See the instinctual migratory pattern of sharks, patterns which, according to their theories of evolution, were fixed tens of millions of years before man walked this earth, were permanently altered in a comparatively short 200 years to fit the passageway carved by the enslaver ships from Africa to New Europe. Because so many African bodies were carelessly tossed over the sides of the enslavers' ships for so long, sharks, like the other creatures gorging themselves with those cut from our coffles, were conditioned by such easy access to food to change their diet and their movement. Think about nature being changed on a diet of Africans. Reflect on the fact that sharks in the Kemetic Ocean now have a much greater desire for human flesh than those in the Pacific Ocean. Think about why this would be so. Take a moment to reflect on the level of irreversible imbalance and disorder just this one change caused in the ocean's ecosystem. And as the greatest example of this raw barbarity today, look at how this conditioning went on for so long that even 2 centuries after the transport of our ancestors have stopped, these sharks continued to move in this new migratory pattern, apparently never to return to their old way. Apparently, like so many of us, with time, their way has been forgotten. And we cannot overlook the fact that we are talking about an ocean here, not a lake or a pond or even a stream. We are talking of an ocean, a massive, massive body of water. We are trying to fathom just how many discarded African bodies would it take to blanket the surface and depth of even a mile wide passageway from Africa's west rim to just the southern coast of New Europe, realizing that most Africans were shipped to the southern hemisphere of New Europe and that European navigators were not always accurate. We are trying to envision a blanket of African bodies that was daily kept fresh for 2 centuries in the Kemetic Ocean alone. In the midst of our replaying the European assault against our very being, we must also remember that Africans did not leave their wars for freedom back in our homeland. Justice is not a place, it is a mentality. Our ancestors never gave up. We carried this battle everywhere we went. We still do. Because we know this, we know that there was no place and no peace on the slavers either. Europeans lived in a constant state of extreme anxiety and trepidation. That's why we were constantly shackled one to another, head to wall, feet to aisle, in locked holds. That is why we are still kept mentally and physically shackled. As we have already pointed out, when we were allowed on deck by those few good white captains, it was only to exercise the cargo so that it would not go completely bad. It was only so that our muscles would not atrophy too much, thereby making us more difficult to sell. When we were on deck, their guns were always drawn and on the ready. And as in prison watchtowers, the crow's nest near the top of the main mast served as a sniper's position to pick off any potentially revolutionary Africans. In fact, it has been noted that they tried to keep this advantaged firing position by punishing any Africans who dared to look up with a club and a lash. This precaution served no purpose other than to increase the level of anxiety and discomfort among the would be revolutionaries. Nonetheless, all their precautions did not prevent the 150 officially reported an untold number of unreported revolts on the high seas. We are all familiar with the story of the Amistad, but it was only one of the successful stories, and it became a theatrical event only because of its focus on another liberal European saving savages from the ravages of a few bad European apples. The movie had nothing to do with us. We are not at its center. We did not tell it through the eyes of our ancestors. Therefore, it is not our story. Their interpretation is not our memory. But regardless of their efforts to co opt and tame our revolutionary spirit, to make us appear as passive, grateful captives aboard these ships, we know that many Europeans died at the hands of enslaved Africans. We know that many ships sank in the deep waters of the Kemetic Oceans, and many Africans commandeered slavers back to their homeland. Even though the large number of fallen crew members did not prevent 2+ million Africans from arriving on just the northern shores of New Europe, their deaths are a sure statement of our indomitable spirit to remain African and free. So it is very vital to our survival as a people, as independent, self defining, self determining, re Africanized nation builders, that we remember this warrior spirit also. Remembrance is key here. We must see our women on these ships being closest to the white heat of our active exploitation, measuring the shifts and movements of the Europeans. We must be able to feel their minds cleverly recording which enemy was responsible for the keys, when and where, searching for any loose tools that could be used by the men to cut through the chains and locks, even diverting the thoughts of the enslavers, drunk with power, away from their fearful watch. We must imagine our youngest sisters and brothers watching their mothers' eyes for signals of what to seize from under the enslavers' noses, when to cause a distractive ruckus, when to slip the tool they have been hiding into the waiting hands of their older brothers and fathers. And we must feel the spirit of these men as they use these tools and information to plan and execute revolt after revolt to overpower the foul smelling, pale devils and take them all back home. There was always a division of revolutionary behavior where everyone contributed equally based on their ability and access to means. As the Akan of West Africa say, the family is an army. Everyone in the family played a role in our confrontations with our captors. We must be fearless enough to imagine how surprised the enslavers were when spiritual warriors came at them, treating them righteously as their enemy, hacking them with handmade weapons and weapons taken from fallen Europeans, breaking them with bare hands, carrying the rage of thousands. We intuitively know the horror Europeans experienced as they were being charged by a people whose power they feared and who had nothing to lose but their pain. We must contemplate these things well, for we know that there were many successes, many more than we have been told about. We know without extensive individual study, because we know that in war, the enemy never speaks of most of his defeats in order to demoralize his enemy. Victories encourage valor, uncertainty and defeat foster resignation. In this case, the Europeans' enemy is us, the descendants of those warriors who victoriously attacked them on these ships. They need to have us voluntarily dismiss our ancestors as willing cowards and relinquish our warrior spirit before we begin to think there is a need to defend ourselves. To counter the stories we know they will fabricate to create the good whites who helped bring about our rebellion. We know that none of our revolts were in any way aided by racial, radical, liberal Europeans with sympathetic, guilty consciences. What mutinies European crews committed against European captains had nothing to do with our freedom. They, like the Civil War, the Jewish Holocaust, and the suppressing of the slave trade, were infighting. The fight of benevolent enemies should never taint our remembrance. We also know we fought more and harder than they tell us because we know our people. We know our strength and the depth of our righteous rage. We know that nothing in hundreds of years of ceaseless capturing and brutalizing would have made us think of surrender. Nothing in 400 years of enslavement in this land made us stop. So, why would anything have caused us to stop before Europeans had a chance to season us? Certainly, our rebellions on the high seas decreased with time, but that was not an African choice. It was because, as reactive and disingenuous as they are, Europeans have the capacity to learn more effective methods of control and domination. They put this learning to work, finding more and more ways to make it increasingly difficult for Africans to successfully revolt. Our lockdown in the hulls became increasingly more brutal, more total. So again, the decline in African revolts was not an African choice. As the forecast says, nothing would have made us stop. Chapter 5, which is titled The Arrival, starts with a quote from Vince Harding. And the black seed of Africa was ruthlessly cast into the winds, into the hungry soil, into the mines, into the furrows, into the forests, into the rivers and the sands, into the eyes and minds and white nightmares of North and South America. What about those Africans who made it to New Europe in one piece? What was their condition? Well, think about it. Think about how you feel after being stuck in a car 8, 12, or 15 hours straight, minus a gas and or restroom stop here and there with a couple of friends or even just by yourself. How do your legs and back feel after one of these trips? How about your driving arm? Was it worse than your neck? Remember how you had to move a little slowly those first few steps, even though you had a comfortable seat with ample leg room, plenty of food and drink, a nice collection of sounds, and even DVDs for some of us, control over the heat and air, a cell phone to keep you company with if you were by yourself, cruise control, and guaranteed roadside assistance to relieve the buildup of any anxiety car trouble might bring. You still rose slowly, aching a little those first few steps. You had to stretch out the stiffness. Remember how it hurt worse the longer the distance you drove between rest stops you made? How smaller cars and higher gas mileage made fewer stops and more spending money, but more stiffness and more aching? Now expand your mind into your ancestors' reality. Imagine this trip lasting 5, 6, 7, 10 weeks or more. Imagine the cushioned comfort of your car seat being transformed into hardened, unforgiving planks of wood. Imagine no windows, no sunlight, no moonlight, no heat on frigid nights, no air conditioning, no drafts on sweltering days, no bathroom stops, no sitting up, just extremely limited room because you are shackled to the person to your left and to the right of you. Think of the boredom of there being no healthy sights to distract your mind or casually daydream about, only nightmares featuring you. Worse still, picture yourself having to lie in the same spot for the vast majority, if not all, of this month and a half or 2 month or more trip on the high seas. Think about how you would feel if that slight discomfort you remember from your infinitely more luxurious car drive turned into a mind numbing pain. And what if that mind numbing pain turned into a frightful, numb, paralyzing painlessness, and even something far enough beyond that to make you wonder if you are still physically alive? What if the minor stiffness from a half day's driving became a nerve stinging immobility that painfully tingles as if you slept on your whole body, not just an arm or hand or leg, but your whole body for too long? Imagine not being able to walk when you arrived at your new destination. Imagine having to learn how to walk again at the end of a whip or a club so that you could quickly appear fit enough to be sold into more pain. Chapter 6 is called Blame and Belief, and it starts with a quote from, one moment, from Nana John Henrik Clark. Greetings, Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. The forecast says the ones who made it through that journey became FBA. Many of us made it through that journey and did not become FBA, but FBA is proud of that journey. FBA feels like they take some part in this American nightmare. FBA feels like they have a reason to celebrate this heritage. Nana John Henry Clark says, the aftermath of the slave trade might be worse than the trade itself, mainly because the major participants in the trade have made a mission out of lying about their participation in this, the greatest of all human tragedies. In the last 20 years, the academic interpreters of the Atlantic slave trade have been pointing the finger at the African participants as though the trade could not have existed without them. Any honest researcher familiar with the documents knows that the role of the African was minor in comparison to that of the European and the Arab. The Atlantic slave trade was a three continent industry that affected a revolution in shipping, in economics, and in world trade. Africans did not have this kind of connection at this juncture in history. And besides, the slave trade was mainly a European and an Arab business. I do not in any way intend to free Africans of any guilt for their participation in this trade. Their involvement was tragic, misguided, and not without significance. But the slave trade would have occurred whether the African participated or not. As we try to put closure on our thoughts about our experience crossing the Kemetic Ocean on this paper, knowing that what we have mentioned barely scratches the surface of what was done to us, try to think about how much effort that we have had to put into forgetting this. Look at how far we have gone to act like this never happened to us. As we revisit this tragic page in our story, we should at least take a few moments to consider the depth of the confusion of any African who, knowing just these few details, says nothing, teaches nothing, builds nothing, does nothing to ensure that we become empowered enough so that this can never happen to us again. The events that have shattered our people were not simply painful ones, they were disasters. They were strange, unnatural catastrophes. Those who survived them could only survive in part because they found ways to forget the catastrophes. When you're still close to past dangers that threaten to wipe you out, even remembrance pains you. Our people forgot a lot of things in order to survive. We even went beyond forgetfulness to forget thoroughly the shattering and the dispersal of a people that was once whole. We have gone so far as to pretend that we have always been these silly little fragments. Forgetfulness is natural, but only for a while, not for all time. Forgetfulness helps the diseased cross over the time of the greatest pain. It is a sort of sleep, like a sleep brought on by herbs to try to help a sick man rest while his disease is has exhausted him. In that case, forgetfulness works toward health. But when the period of forgetfulness is prolonged unnaturally, then it doesn't work towards health, it works towards death. But then again, we are assuming that we truly do want to know, that we truly do want to remember that part of our story that lies in the current and in the bottom of this watery grave, to use our consciousness, our African center to see, to feel what our ancestors, what ourselves felt is essential if we are to recover from our denial of being truly African. This is a psychologically enforced choice. Menticide is denial. Because of how this part of the Ma'afa has been portrayed, and because of how we have run from the idea of it, we do not see these ancestors as actually human, as actually having really existed under these conditions. That would be too painful, and the truth might make us rise in righteous indignation. Not seeing them as real people, as individuals who, throughout whose genes we could not exist, allows us to dismiss them as a far off buried fiction and deem the scientific analysis of their dehumanization as no more than an exaggerated myth. Most of us do not see and do not want to see or feel their pain. We do not want to know. We want nothing to do with these destroyed people, these black savages brought kicking and screaming into a civilizing whiteness, not realizing that we are they. This truth we desperately run from in hot pursuit of others' lies because we feel shame over how these lies have portrayed us. Yet deep down, so many of us still believe these lies. So these memories of the war against our ancestors remain out of our reach by choice. What you do not feel cannot affect you. What you do not feel of what you are that is painful and anti European cannot take you away from the comfort of an anti African menticide cloaked in worthless material possessions and phantom ideas of liberal democracy in another's kingdom. Without connection, though, you will never become endarkened. You will never see. This is why so many of us buy or manufacture flimsy excuses which deny our ancestors' pain. Some of us are so psychologically distant and confused from the lifestyle and furnishings of rural or urban living in traditional African society that we even subscribe to the fiction that the extreme discomfort of riding across an ocean lying on an unforgiving wooden planks in the bowels of a suffocating diseased ship was not agonizingly painful to our ancestors. This state, they ignorantly argue, is what we were accustomed to. These misguided individuals, determined to remain in a mental at all costs, would have us to believe the savage African thesis about our ancestors. They comfortably subsist in the space between Europeans and these backward black people, proud to say that they are not truly of Africa, as they use this contrast to pull themselves closer and closer to the skirts of European. Riding high on the fragile edge of the desperate conviction that no matter how much more it would take to get the Europeans' love, at least they are like them. At least they are not those poor, uncivilized Africans. They savor their self hatred, redefining it as aspiration. Except for those who would choose to think we cannot and should not try to convince these individuals that comfort was quite characteristic of the furnishings in the homes in the traditional African villages and cities. In order to live with their misappropriated arrogance, they have to believe this nonsense in the same way that they have to blindly believe that Europeans brought African civilization and religion, and that they, as a result of being brought to the arrhythmic heart of the European cultural wasteland, are the most privileged because they have had the advantage of being deeply assimilated into the European brand of civilization and religion. This is the same majority who believe that the shipping of our ancestors across the Kemetic Ocean officially ceased because of the Europeans' Christian consciousness and not because of the reasons of economic competition and expediency. You cannot wake those doggedly determined to remain menticidal. See, FBA is menticidal forecast. That's who FBA is. They're this group of people that we just described here. To search in Sankofan fashion for our past, into our past for evidence of our essence, to look back deeply would truly be to see what has never left you and is indeed catching up no matter how fast or how far you run. We are African, in that we are the culmination of our ancestors. To look back would be to force us to admit this indisputable fact. To look back would be to see how much of our energy has been wasted in trying to get away from ourselves, trying to run from the tragedy that forged our fragmented, frightened shadow of a personality. Yet, there are those of us who are quite aware that much is not right with the European picture. These conscious Africans know our enemy could not possibly have told our story through our ancestors' eyes. The images, the language, the counts, the explanations of those who worked to destroy us could never reflect our truth, for they are not us. They are the enslavers. They are Urugu in the flesh. Therefore, as conscious, self defining Africans, we must ask, why we are still using the term the Middle Passage to describe this horrific trip. We are no longer using slave trade to identify the whole experience that issue and what issued from it. We say Maafa for this. So why do we still say the Middle Passage? If we are to be an empowered, self-defining people, we need to carefully determine the language we use to describe our ordeal for ourselves. No one else should or can do this for us. Words used by others for their relatively minor tragedies in a society dominated by their mass media interests take focal priority over ours when ours are defined using the same words. Very few individuals associate the word Holocaust, which simply means the mass slaughter of a people, with what happened to Africans, even though what happened to European Jews was statistically insignificant by comparison. Terms designed by others to describe what happened to us for us usually grossly miss the mark of what actually happened to us, making the perpetrators who control the description of that and of what happened appear much more humane than they are. Equally important concepts given in the language family of languages of our people are inadequate to explain our thoughts as an African people. People who study African languages know this. Language is not only deno- denotative, but also connotative. For Africans, connotations carry our historical spiritual weight. A people's language is their way of describing the world through which their evolved way of thinking. Africans and Europeans see the world through very different eyes. We are different people. Only an African language can best describe what we know and see. Many of us recognize that term, the Middle Passage, is no more than a euphemism softening the horrendous psychological feeling that part of the Ma'afa spent on the Kemetic Ocean naturally brings. We know that for untrained ears, it subconsciously feels more like a mundane leisure cruise than the horrid journey that it was. Middle in no way connotes the horror Africans experienced. It is a neutral word indicating nothing more than a location, middle, between Africa and this land, while passage indicates only a place traveled. Slave trade is no different. First and foremost, trade indicates equal and or fair exchange of goods and services. We weren't traded by any economic measure. We were stolen, and theft is not trade. Europeans may, from their vantage point, call it trade. They handled both ends of the exchange, and both sides benefited, or rather, as family, they all benefited no matter which side received more. So they can say that they traded with each other. We, on the other hand, should know that this trade in no way benefited us. We were the merchandise. Along with the profit, the slave trade's prime directive was to destroy us and any connection we had with our motherland, so that we would slave for others with blind devotion. If for this reason alone, we would be fools to consciously follow their linguistic lead. Therefore, to view the Middle Passage with an African mind, we will use the Twi word, which is a dialect of the Akan people of West Africa, Notorisi Otaku, pronounced Notorisi Otuka, to describe this horrific event in our story, literally Notorisi Otaka, which means genocidal, forced immigration, exile, and captivity. This fits the depiction we are seeking because it speaks to both the intent and process. The way in which we were captured and brought here was against every fiber of our will and fully intended to destroy all psychological and genetic memory of ourselves. It makes no difference whether we use this particular African term or another. What is important is that we use African terminology. Also, as warriors and spiritual being beings holding the most profound honor and reverence for the spirits of those who died for us in the Notorisi Otoko, we have to bring our African minds to visualize the Kemetic Ocean as our largest shrine. As warrior scholars, as Asafo, we have to apprehend and appreciate this great body of water because it contains the greatest concentration of ancestral emotional content of our restless warrior spirit. Therefore, as a self respecting African who honors our ancestors, we must make it a place where we go to wade, pray, meditate, pour libation, make offerings, and cry out for ancestral strength in our battle for righteous justice. To do this, we have to again become those who involuntarily and unconsciously participated in the creation of this living shrine, a shrine of water, of untold amounts of substance which we cannot live without. We have to become our ancestors. You see, shrines do not just appear, they are human identifications of sacred spaces where the connection with the Creator, deities, and ancestors are closest and most accessible to those who can see. So, this connection is something we must put forth the effort to make. Everything is in place except us. Only then can we go inside a mind so damaged by fear that it thrives on forgetfulness and insanity. Only then will we find release through the understanding of our historically grounded mission. For only then will we be able to understand why a people would leave one of its most important shrines unattended and even forgotten for scores of generations as the spiritual energy within it simmered, raging in on itself while waiting for release through a heartfelt recognition by the descendants of those who created it. Sounds to me like we need to make a trip to the Kemetic Ocean, guys. Maybe that's the goal. Thinking of the hurt, the rage our ancestors feel from being forgotten, forsaken. Invisibility reduces our story to nothingness. Division of the past from the present, of the ancestors from the living, closes off all possibilities of conscious empowerment. Remembrance gives us life, force, power. Now, with this grasp of reality, only an idiot, ignoramus, diehard Negro, or individual otherwise intellectually incapable of understanding that we are our ancestors would ask, why do we continue to dwell on the past? Our ancestors watched the vanquished among us fall for and defend arguments defending the humanity of the enslavers with unspeakable shame. They seethed at the very idea of anyone who would participate in their dehumanization and inhumane treatment, no matter how distant in our past, could be worthy of our emotional attachment in any form or other than in any form other than righteous rage. It is hard not to envision their dismay as Anglophilic Negroes doggedly work to fabricate a slavery in traditional Africa that was equal to that of our enslavement by Europeans. Can you feel the disbelief they feel about those among us who fight so hard to pursue a policy of forgiveness and forgetfulness toward those who sought to destroy them and still seek to destroy us? Murder has no statute of limitations. And as the law applies to individuals, so too does it apply to nations. Who cares about how Europeans say they felt? Even if they were not proven liars, why should that be any of our concern? Does the innocent African care whether the judge who sentenced him has 20 to 20 years said he felt bad about doing it? Did our ancestors give a damn about their enslavers' self serving rationalizations about or psychological discomfort over treating them as if they were less than scum? I think not. The Negro intellectuals arguing that enslavers and the enslaved were equally pained and destroyed by the institution of slavery have committed heinous acts of treason. These are not defenses from innocence. Their betrayals of us are consciously committed with forethought, malice, and without remorse. There is no comparison between the case of the enslaved and the enslaver, except in the eyes of the enslaver and those slaves who seek their validation. There is no commonality anywhere in the emotional or physical pain between the enslaver and the enslaved. None whatsoever. Listening to Negroes instructing us that our enslavement was in the past and to get over it, and lost souls advising us that in order to achieve inner peace, we have to release our anger and embrace our enemies in their and our churches, temples, and mosques, at work and on the streets, in our homes and beds, is treasonous. Too many of us in order to feel useful while expending most of our energies in denial and suppressing the pain in hopes that suppression will lead to release, also waste an enormous amount of time debating over numbers, debating over how many of us were murdered, as if fewer numbers would make it less traumatic or less wrong. If they murdered one of us, that is far too many. After what was done to us listening to the truth of liars makes no African sense. Even the lowest estimates given by sterile, conniving European statisticians working to validate European politicians seeking to minimize or universalize our pain by using unrepresentative samples or only looking at one facet of our maafa, in other words, our trails of blood and tears, the dungeons or the transport ships, dwarf those of any other people's Holocaust. Questioning Eurocentric truths makes us centered, not insensitive or spiteful. As our historical underdogs, as our historical underdogs, we have to remain political in our efforts to tell the truth. For until lions have historians, tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. We must think as our historians of lions. So let us focus on what our scholars have to say about how many of us were murdered during the Ma'afa and its notoriously Otuko. According to Nana John Henrik Clark, we can start with no less than 60 million. Yet he also said that 100 million is a more likely estimate. John G. Jackson agrees. S. E. Anderson, although like his intellectual predecessors Eric Williams and W. E. B. Du Bois, would have us turn the enslavement of Africans into only a slight deviation from a human norm, said that we should give a total of no less than 280 million because we have to account for those who would have been born during the destruction of African people. Think about the fact that when a young African male or female is murdered, he or she is not the only one murdered. Every individual that person was ever to produce through the end of the line of his or her generations is also murdered. In the long run, this is a hidden genocidal accelerant because this intergenerational genocide does not show up in the statistics. Here, genocide is not even detected or defined as genocide because those who are murdered are never born. Those who work this evil against us know how to kill the roots. When we discuss the numbers lost in this trade, we are in an endless discussion of how many, and that depends on who you're listening to. If 20 million cleared Gori, that's just one fortress and not even the largest one. 20 million cleared through that one place, and Gori was late in getting started in the monster. And the monster, the largest of the slave forts, was Elamina Castle, whose dungeons could hold over 1,000 at a time. Let's put these together. One figure to add is that of those lost in the movement from the hinterlands to the coast. Sometimes 7 out of 10 got lost. Sometimes slave catchers in competition with each other or just for meanness and spite killed each other's captives. That means that 100% got lost. 10 out of 10 got lost. Now, these statistics that didn't get in anyone's computer Some slave captains were thieves and cheats working for absentee slave owners. They would load, say, 350 slaves on a ship in their log list, in their log 300, stop at a port and sell 50 and put the proceeds directly in their pocket. These statistics got lost. In an attempt to help our students understand the magnitude of these numbers, because in a world overrun by statistics, extremely large ones carry so little additional meaning. I used the population of this country as a guide because I was aware of Anderson's 280 million estimate. I used Clark's 100 million as the grand, but as he recognized, undercounted total. I would draw the silhouette of this country on a blackboard and draw out four vertical lines on it, dividing it into five fairly equal parts. Then, after explaining at that time the population of this country was around 250 million, I would erase two of the fifths and explain this is how many of us were murdered. Now, using the same image, I don't even have to divide it into fourths or fifths or anything else. I would simply erase the entire outline and say, this is how many of us were murdered. Either way, the point is made. Our children sit quietly and think. Some truths don't require a detailed explanation. And finally, consider how secure one would have to be in their menticide to find solace in blaming Africans for the Maafa. Like those of us who side with Europeans in trying to find ways to blame the lynching of so many African men, women, and children on themselves or other family members, these happily vanquished Africans try so hard to find ways to point at ourselves for what was done to us. Specifically, they try to blame Africans for the capture, sale, and transport of Africans on the continent. While we know that enslaving individuals has been among us since societies were first organized, we also know that until the Arab and Europeans began this practice among themselves and on the continent, this was not a violently aggressive, permanent, and intergenerational, color based dehumanization of people. With them, slavery became vicious, and this would be only natural because a people's institutions are modeled to fit their acyclic imperatives, their cultural personalities. Our mistake, or rather the mistake of those among us who confuse the supremacist, genocidal, European, and Arab slaving mission with our participation in it, is that we, as oppressed subjects of our enslavers, have a great difficulty separating the initiator, manager, and profiteer of our enslavement, the Europeans, from those among us who were drawn into participation as obedient flunkies, the Negroes and lost souls, because they became so culturally disoriented and disordered as individuals that they came to believe that there was no other way to survive. Briefly, several points should always be kept in mind when trying to come to grips with the treason that poisoned the African ranks. First, as Chancellor Williams instructed us, we must follow the migrations of a people in flight in order to ascertain the means of their destruction. In this discussion, we are particularly concerned with the why as to their actions while in flight from their destruction by others, especially those operating on the leash of others. As Africans left the ordered structure of their societies to avoid invasion, violation, and domination, their ability to provide for themselves was also disintegrated. Those possessions and ways which validated their humanity, their sense of family, community, and individuality, their definitions of manhood and womanhood, slowly broke down also and were replaced with a desperate, survival oriented mentality. They no longer grew their own crops or herded their own livestock. They operated from the impoverished hand to mouth. Life became hard, brutal, and unpredictable. Within this circumstance, boys still grew to the age of men, but these warriors rose only to remain unfulfilled. They had no means of expressing their divine role of providing and protecting. They naturally sought fulfillment. With time, the loss of connection to a resource rich people oriented value systems encouraged them to surrender to those wayward gang like ways which gave them the illusionary prestige of things. They either served as mercenary hunters of Africans or formed bands of their own to do the same in hopes of eliminating the middleman. In this way, they hoped to rise to warriorhood and property through the Europeans who paid them for their human goods. We have to deeply consider a situation so desperate that one would capture family for profit. We have to understand what level of despondency would drive an African mother to sell her child for crack today and be able to transfer the understanding of that psychologically damaging context back in time to those Africans who betrayed us. Second, this artificially manufactured and escalated infighting among African families came with the clear fear that if they did not enslave other Africans for Europeans, then those Africans would enslave you for them. It was a situation where the weakened were pitted in a loser take all battle with an equally weakened people. The vicious cycle of this European initiated divide and conquer strategy set brother violently against brother. In studying this, we find that the European armed both sides, often in an imbalanced fashion, so as to continue the conflict and to ensure a continuous supply of African captives. The sequence of events and deceit leading to this grossly imbalanced trade and resultant racial treason is well summarized by Joseph E. Harris in his Africans and Their History. In order to understand why Africans participated in the slave trade, it is necessary first to realize that many Africans had long been accustomed to European goods, first coming across the Sahara Desert and later on European vessels. There was thus a demand for those items that African merchants had already engaged in supplying: cloth, metalware, trinkets, and most significantly, firearms and gunpowder, in exchange for ivory, gold, and cola nuts. Another crucial factor is that European merchants were established on the coast from the early 15th century. Consequently, they had various kinds of contacts and were quite knowledgeable about local African politics in several regions. As the demand for slaves grew, they used their knowledge of African factionalism to play one leader against another or one group against another. Kings were sometimes given firearms and other goods to raid neighboring areas in exchange for war prisoners. One faction of a dynasty was armed against another, and young men were hired to raid for slaves in another region. It must be remembered that African labor built many of the European homes, business establishment, mission statements and stations, and so on. It is very conceivable, therefore, that some of those laborers supplied by African kings and merchants could have been shipped abroad as slaves without an awareness on the part of the wider African community. In any case, Europeans demanded laborers or slaves. The African merchant had to comply or lose his business. The acquisition of firearms by one group encouraged another to acquire the same, and the main source was the European. This caused keen competition between European merchants, sometimes resulting in one European group supporting a particular African ally and another group supporting other Africans. In either case, Africans were captured and enslaved. Once arms were acquired, a supply of parts and powder had to be maintained. Thus, a given king had to maintain the flow of slaves, first by supplying prisoners, debtors, social outcasts, and the destitute, but later by conducting frequent raids, sometimes in outlying areas of his own kingdom. The slave trade therefore caused and perpetuated many wars of devastation and depopulation over 400 years. Other examples could be cited to show how this trade originated and persisted over the centuries, but the conclusion would be the same. A minority of African rulers and merchants succumbed to the attraction of wealth and power to the point that they sold fellow human beings into slavery. Third, Africans in service to European imperialism were not aware of the denigration and savagery of European slavery. We hear this excuse often. They knew nothing of the record of Europeans turning their own people into slaves, or that the treatment of indigenous people around the world of Africans in New Europe. As many of our scholars have noted, the act of enslaving people is as old as society itself. Enslavement of Africans by other Africans prior to European invasion was both voluntary and involuntary, although largely involuntary. It was the result of unpaid debt, loss of war, and a number of other critical social conditions. Never was the humanity of the enslaved person questioned, so he or she was treated accordingly. It was never a perpetual condition, nor were the offspring of enslaved persons enslaved by default. And the enslaved person could rise as high in society as any free person. In no way was a person's enslavement based on his or her race. European style slavery was quite different. With reference to the Africans, it was based solely on race. It was perpetual into future generations. It was inhumane and dehumanizing for enslaved Africans. Africans who worked to capture other Africans for Europeans were no more aware of this than they were of the homosexual nature of the European. And the desperate need for survival did not override their deep sense of humanity. Fourth, The number of Africans enslaved in Europe is incomparable to the number of Africans enslaved by Africans prior to European enslavement. The number of Africans enslaved by other Africans at any point in time prior to European invasion, excluding the so called trade of African captives in the Arab states and Asia, especially China, was insignificant. Fifth, the Europeans were the premier capitalists. They perfected materialism and the idea that anything, living or non living, material or immaterial, could be bought, and sold without care as a commodity. Our enslavement in the Americas, in Europe, and on the continent was their business venture, their plan, their operation, their system, their dream. They rose because we fell. They made and accumulated the profits from the enslavement of Africans. No one else benefited in any way to the degree that they did and continue to do so. They made and continue to make billions of dollars from our capture, containment, and labor. A picture of this most infamous and notoriously barbaric of the African slave traders is found at the very beginning of this chapter. His name is Tipu Tib, and although he is an African, discussed in virtually every European publication dealing with the capture of Africans on the continent, in order to lead us toward blaming ourselves for our own destruction, his profits were limited and short lived compared to every European merchant of note. Furthermore, as a reward for his treason, he died a powerless, dejected man without a people. To even think to draw a meaningful comparison between either the profits or the magnitude of participation by Europeans and Africans in our enslavement is ludicrous. In comparison to Europeans, no African people or individuals even remotely benefited economically or otherwise from our enslavement. Similarly, the drug dealers of our day, the street corner pushers, do not reap even a tiny fraction of the true material, psychological, or social profits of their corruptive business activities. They justly only reap the penalties of betrayal. Although these five extremely poignant points do not exhaust the menticidal reasons why some Africans felt compelled to aid Europeans in their capture of other Africans, they should suffice. Truthfully, any one of them should be acceptable if we know who we are and why Europeans do what they do. From a non victim blaming, African centered perspective, these points simply highlight the fact that evidence of action does not always explain the cause of action, especially when the official writers of our story are the children of those who forced and used the action of others for their selfish, barbaric benefit. To understand this otherwise seemingly contradiction to racial loyalty using the world about us today, we draw a clear line from those who were led to betray their family during our enslavement and those who are continuing the tradition today. Our gangs provide the perfect contemporary example of our intra-racial exploitation for the benefit of our destroyers. Greetings, Culture Education. Thank you so much for tuning in. Never forget, the past is the present. What happened in the past affects, creates the present. Therefore, we must, as we have for those who assisted in our original enslavement by Europeans, look at the source, the beginnings of gang activity, who profits from it most, to fully understand why the newest traders on the streets of our communities are gang members. We must ask from our African center many questions. Questions such as, do they control any markets or the economy in their communities? Do they police their communities? Do they have any other reasonable and readily available means to attain and express their manhood and womanhood? Do they define the trappings of prestige and power? Do they bring in the drugs? Do they, in any meaningful way, profit from the drug market in their community? Are there any other goods of worth that the masters of their economy will allow them to trade in? Do they arm rival gangs and incite wars that feed the new slavery in the prison system? Do they have any true conception of themselves as members of an African nation? Are we to blame them for their ignorance as we should those Negroes in dutiful service to their masters? Others, consciously and intelligently misinterpreting our historical facts to their people's favor, would have us credit Europeans with much, much greater humanity than we should give them with respect to our enslavement. So why, knowing the truth of liars, would we stoop to study others for our truth? Why would we cite the analysis of Basil Davis, Philip Curtin, Hugh Thomas, or Richard Poe, regardless of the intelligence they have gathered, as the sole expertise on our historical fact, while ignoring the conscious genius of John Henrik Clark, Joseph E. Harris, Chancellor Williams, or John G. Jackson? Why would we leave it to liberal Europeans, validated by their self serving brothers, as the supreme experts on Africans to explain our story? How can we knowingly speak of what, how, and why this happened to us based on their interpretation of reality? Are we that vanquished, that desperate to be whitewashed, that we would sell our soul to evil to achieve their love? Do we feel so forsaken that we would arbitrarily guess at our ancestors' way of using another's compass? We should know, who betrayed you yesterday will not save you today. He who betrayed you yesterday will not save you today. What are ancestors, what are our ancestors saying about those among us hell bent on defending the European, who are blaming the Africans involved in it more than the Europeans who controlled and dominated it? Are we a people so beat into senseless submission and in such fear of a liberating truth that we hatefully look within for the cause of our plight and project that self hatred onto those who look like us now and before, all the while reaching out to our destroyers for love and authentication with burnt, slashed, broken, destroyed, outstretched hands? On the other hand, visualize us honoring our ancestors. Picture us not dismissing, but correctly directing our children's righteous rage against our enemies. Think about the level of active consciousness our children could achieve if only we taught them the details of this part of our story. Consider the uncompromising power that they could recognize in themselves as a result of our telling them the whole truth for once. But these are not just wild imaginings. The direction is being given by default. Truth rises whether we consciously transfer it to coming generations or not. The pendulum of justice swings. What Europeans have done to this world is already coming back at them. They have necessarily created a world in their likeness. As a minority, unable to assimilate or commit full genocide against the majority people, Europeans sought to embed a mental ideology of universalism within Africans, with Europeans remaining at the center in order to prevent rebellion against their inevitable destruction. They seem to not know that they cannot hide, especially from those they made in their image. Time reveals all. Genius, evil, or otherwise, is not long hidden from those it touches. Their way has become that of their victims, and the uncontainable expression of the righteous rage of those they have created through their malevolence is already making the Europeans' original violent nature appear pacifist by comparison. Everything they do, we have done better. That is our historical fact. That has not changed. In this reality of ignorance and injustice, that advantage has had no choice but to focus its energies on the negative and European way. It dominates their senses and therefore the senses of all they dominate. Justice must be bought, but it will not be born of guilt or scientific awakening. Those among us foolish, desperate, or treasonous enough to serve as watchdogs in any capacity will be served the same fate as their chosen masters. They deserve nothing less. So, as you can see, this book talked about our destruction. This book talked about all of the things that happened to us and told us to not stop at the descriptions that he gave, but to go deeper, right? We must go deeper and think more clearly and imagine more vividly the things that have been done to us, the things that were done to our ancestors. We must also think more critically about the sacred spaces and the things that we hold dear. We must recognize that the great Kemetic Ocean is a place of power for us. And as I said earlier, maybe that's a place we need to make a trip to, take a trip to harness that energy, that righteous rage, to pour water and to pour libation to the ancestors that we know of and those strong, powerful African ancestors that we don't know of. We need to stop looking to Europeans to explain our story. They're never going to explain our story the right way. The forecast says this was a great live and this is a really good book. Thank you, forecast. You can thank MG2. This was already in my collection and on schedule to be read for 2026, but MG2 brought it back to my remembrance. And this is the book that he requested and sponsored. So thank you, MG2. But we have to get to the point where we're not looking at the African traders as the traders that they were because they didn't generate the types of generational wealth that the white enslavers who controlled the whole enslavement operation had. They weren't able to generate the type of ongoing, they didn't have the infrastructure, right? So even though they betrayed us, some of them, and Tiputep is the one that they always hold up before us, even though he betrayed us, he didn't have the network of connections and Europeans to continue to support his ongoing wealth accumulation. And he was ostracized from from his village, from the people that he lived around. So he died alone and he will be forgotten, which from an African cosmological perspective and standpoint is worse than death, because to be forgotten or to be not to be venerated is an eternal death, right? Is to go into the outer darkness. If anyone wants to come up, you can. I dropped the link in the chat. I want to thank all of you for being here with me tonight. I value each and every one of you. You guys have no idea what it means to me for you to spend this time with me. That's the end of the text. We'll be moving on to a new book next week, something a little bit longer. I want to thank Sister Ra and the elders listening with her, KW Don 7, The Forecast Radio, Anthony McPhail, Culture Education, and everyone that, and Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, and everyone else that's listening. I know Bawana Haguziki is listening. I know Brother Bakari is listening. I know Oni Tase is listening. I know that Dorico Cooper is listening. I know that Arbiter 547 or 567 is listening, and all of the new listeners. Thank you so much for being here and being a part of this journey. I value your inputs. I'm grateful for your financial support. I thank each and every one of you. And just remember that we are a people whole and complete. We were people whole and complete before the Eurasian came and interrupted our timeline. And we will be a people whole and complete after we come back to our collective selves. Kebuka. When we come back to our collective selves, we are people whole and complete. We can trust our intuition. They are the other. White is an inclusionary status to the exclusion of the African. Okay? These are just some basic things we need to remember. I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. I value you, and I hope you have a good night. Thanks for hanging with me tonight. I know it's late. Peace, guys.